Why are we celebrating this feast of the body and blood of Christ? You would think Holy Thursday was the proper time to do that, would you not? The Lord's Supper Mass? Well, as so often happens in the church, when there's a problem, you can trace it back to the clergy. In the Middle Ages, there was a priest who began to preach against what the church had always believed for 1,200 years, that Jesus is present in the bread and the wine of the Eucharist. And to counter that, various types of Eucharistic devotions developed. Things that we take for granted today, or at least we used to take for granted, like Eucharistic processions through the streets, benediction with the Blessed Sacrament, exposition, making visits to the Blessed Sacrament for quiet prayer. We take that all for granted, but up until the Middle Ages, that didn't exist in the church. There was no need for it. These were devotions which developed against this priest who began to preach against what the church had always believed, the presence of Jesus in the sacrament, which we call the Eucharist. But there's a flip side to this which is dangerous. I like all these Eucharistic devotions. I think they're wonderful, but there's a flip side. We have to keep reminding ourselves that the Eucharist is not something Jesus has given us. The Eucharist is an event. The Eucharist is essentially an event. And the farther back you go, especially when you get to the Scriptures, as we heard today, the event is a meal. Jesus established a meal for his followers to partake in. And that doesn't sound very remarkable unless we remember where Jesus was coming from. In his day, and even I think in most of the Middle East today, meals were rather sacred events. Not in the sense of religion, but in the sense of relationships. The only person you eat with is your family. To be invited to eat with a group of people of the same family was not only an honor, but from that point on, you were considered a member of that family. To eat with another person was to establish a relationship which was permanent. That's why Jesus was killed. Jesus died because he had bad table manners. He ate with anybody. He ate with everybody, especially the bad people, the others, the ones we look down upon. That's why he was killed, not by the Romans. The Romans killed him because they were afraid he was a king. But his own religious authorities put him to death for bad table manners. And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves, that the Eucharist that we celebrate week in and week out is a meal. And the whole notion of this meal is coming from the time of Jesus, when to be invited to a meal not only drew you into a relationship with those who were eating that meal, but also established with you responsibilities for the people with whom you were eating. So when Jesus says, "Take and eat," he is saying, you are wanted by my Father and by me and by my Spirit. You don't barge in on a meal. You have to be invited. And Jesus invites us to come to the table so that we can be part of the family which we celebrated last Sunday, the Trinity, so that we can be drawn back into that familial relationship which exists and is mind-boggling between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. God wants us in that relationship forever. On the other hand, by being invited to the table and by accepting the invitation to eat with Jesus, We are also accepting the responsibility of eating with each other. And that we are establishing relationships with each other which override everything else. We are called to consume the presence of Jesus, the body and blood of Christ, the person of Jesus, so that we can be united in Jesus together as the family of God. And that doesn't mean just people who are baptized. They obviously are called to the table. But all the world is potentially called to the table. God doesn't just want Christians. He wants everybody in his family. He wants to put out his arms and encircle the whole world because he created all of us. We in America, we labor under some really difficult problems when it comes to eating together. We do it less and less because of various things. Do you realize that most people in the course of human history spent most of every waking hour of the day either producing, cultivating, transporting, preparing, or consuming their food? I think most of the world is still that way, outside of the first world. Most of their waking hours are spent working towards their meal together. What Jesus is saying to us is, our life must be spent drawing all of God's people into this banquet, as it is portrayed in the Scriptures, in which we will all be one with the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And the first stages of that banquet are the Eucharist we are in the midst of celebrating.